We're coming to you live. We have someone that traveled all the way from the US to come here. This is Winkler. We are very excited for him to be here. It's a great honor. The first thing that I did when I saw Ira was basically to ask him to sign my books. Thank you so much for being here. It's a great pleasure. It's a great honor for us and for everybody who's watching from home.
Thanks. I'm honored. I was not expecting to be the only in-person speaker, so it's kind of nice and weird. But anyway, thanks for having me. It's really appreciated. And I'm talking about human security engineering. And this is kind of a new term for everybody because I invented it, I think. You know, there probably was something like human security officer in Star Trek on Deep Space Nine, but that doesn't really count here. But human security engineering, there was on the previous talk, they mentioned ransomware. And when you mention ransomware, everybody looks at it as a user issue. They're like, why did that stupid user click on these things and so on, no matter what we do? And the reality of the situation is behind every stupid user is a stupider security professional that basically put the user in a position to click on a message, and then after that, knew that they were going to click on it and didn't do enough to stop them. So do you blame the user? Because I'll talk about this going on in a little bit, but essentially you're blaming the proximity of where the error was initiated. And I'm using the term user-initiated loss, and I'll cover that. I only have a half hour and 25 slides, so I better start moving. So let's talk about the Twitter hack. And, the sad part is most people have forgotten about the Twitter hack. But a year ago in ancient cyber history, what happened was there was an attack where somebody, a criminal mastermind, took over the top accounts on Twitter. They took over President Obama's accounts. They took over Joe Biden's accounts. They took over all these accounts with more than 1 million followers. And at the time, Twitter came out and they called it an advanced social engineering attack, a sophisticated social engineering attack. And then they mentioned this mastermind and all that sort of stuff. And then when they looked into it and they caught the person really, really quickly, which says he wasn't much of a mastermind, he was 17 years old. And this 17-year-old mastermind outsmarted all of Twitter's internal security. And so when you stop and think about it, what did the person really do? They used lots of social engineering, and they determined that what happened was just calling people up. They found out that there was administrator tools that basically let any administrator reset people's passwords. And it turns out that 1,000 people, 20% of Twitter's employees had access to change this. And what made this really, really heinous was about, 2 years before, some person who was a German engineer who was a contractor, and basically when he resigned from Twitter, he said, screw it, and he deleted Donald Trump's Twitter account because Donald Trump's Twitter account, it's obvious. But anyway, to that extent, you got to stop and think. They knew something could happen, so what did they do? They locked Donald Trump's Twitter account, okay? What about the other accounts? And yes, it was a coordinated phishing attack where they went ahead and compromised multi-factor authentication. But still, why did they allow access to a tool that could compromise thousands of top accounts? Well, pretty much any Twitter account except President Trump's at the time. Now, I'm going to compare this to Cloudflare. And Cloudflare, about the same time as the Twitter hack, all of a sudden went down and took down a significant portion of the websites on the internet. And what happened was, in the case of Twitter, they put out like a message from like a mid-level engineer, basically was the face of the Twitter hack, and he was putting out things that said sophisticated social engineering, we're improving awareness and everything like that. In the case of Cloudflare, Matt Prince, to his credit, came out as the CEO and said, we experienced, and basically this massive outage occurred because an engineer was basically modifying a routing table, and that engineer made an error in how they did that. And somebody replied back on Twitter and said, I would hate to be that engineer. And the CEO of Cloudflare basically said, you know what? It's not the engineer's fault. His quote was, it's a failure of leadership that one person making one error could take down our entire network. That is essentially the right answer, a failure of leadership. So anyway, let's go back to talk about safety science. I'm going to talk first about old school safety science. Safety science, a lot of people ignore. In cybersecurity, we think we're the first profession ever that had to deal with human error. I hate to break it to a lot of cybersecurity people, but we're not the snowflakes we think we are. Just about every profession in the world has had to deal with human error of one form or another. And old school safety science, because safety science gets millions and millions of dollars, because if a person injures themselves in a factory, the factory could go down. If people are injured, companies get sued. Hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars a year are because people do things that injure themselves. So safety science came to be, and initially old school safety science said, if somebody injured themselves on the job, why were they stupid enough to injure themselves on the job? That was old school safety science. It was the person's fault. It was always an analysis of why the user or the other person was wrong. Sorry, I hope everybody's talking back there because I'm not interested instead of technical errors. I'd rather have not interested instead of technical errors. But anyway, so this is like essentially blaming a canary for dying in a coal mine. Canaries are supposed to die in a coal mine. They're supposed to die before people die because the environment is unsafe. Instead, in cybersecurity, what do we say? We're like, we just need better awareness. We just need funnier awareness. We just need more entertaining videos. Again, that's like saying, let's put a gas mask on a canary in a coal mine. Because the problem isn't the level of awareness. The problem isn't the user. The problem is the environment the users are in that create all these problems. So anyway, let's talk about this as operational problems. Proximity doesn't explain a lot. In other words, let's say, for example, a bus driver is driving a bus and a tire falls off. Do you blame the bus driver? Well, in some rare cases, maybe the bus driver drove over a curb into a wall or something like that, then yes, you blame the bus driver on certain conditions, that there were not mechanical errors. Generally, if a wheel falls off a bus, that's because of poor maintenance on the bus, poor inspections on the bus and everything like that. And what they do is they do post-mortems. In the medical profession, for example, every time somebody dies in a hospital, the hospital sits down on a regular basis and says, okay, why in the last week these people died? What could we have done better? Was there some malfeasance, or were there a series of errors that occurred? Somebody actually went through, safety science people looked at the medical profession, and they determined that, for example, when people die in surgery because of what's considered an error by the doctor doing the surgery, they found, why did the doctor do that specific act? And at the time the doctor did that specific act, in general, it was the right decision. The problem was there was a chain of events before that which led to that decision being made. And they had to look back in the chain of events and say, okay, early on in that chain of events, what could have been done different that the doctor wouldn't have made that decision at that point, which led to the death? And that requires a full postmortem from start to finish as to what happened at every step along the way. When we look at new school safety science, which took this into account, essentially, the user is really just the proxy, and I'm using cybersecurity now. I'm going to transition and make parallels between safety science and cybersecurity. Pretty much, a user is just part of the system. A user is not, frankly, awareness is awesome, but awareness professionals are well-meaning, but sometimes they have this Pollyanna view. Hopefully Pollyanna translates. I think it's a European story. But, they have this idealistic view of the user. We want to make the user, the paragon of virtue and everything. That's just not going to happen. A user, no matter how much you think of them, is still just a part of the system. Much like a bus driver is part of the bus, essentially, much like a doctor's part of a surgery team. They're just a part of the system. And what they realize is that in safety science, if a user makes a mistake, that's a failure of the whole system. Because a user just didn't magically come into being and make an error. The user was put in a system that presented the user with a condition, and the user acted on the condition. Maybe it was a lack of awareness, maybe it was, of malice, whatever it happened to be. The user failed in their thing, which set off a chain of events that caused the failure. Now, what they do is they review all enabling factors. And again, users just the proximity of the error, and the proximity is just a symptom of the overall problem with the system. Like ransomware, the problem is not the user clicked on the message. Why was the user stupid enough to click on ransomware? The thing was, why did the system fail that allowed ransomware to lock up the whole network? And again, user error is just a symptom of what's wrong. So, most people would not know this, but I am certified as a master scuba diver trainer. I love scuba diving. I can't go scuba diving at the moment, but such is life. So anyway, the reason I have this picture, this is actually what I'm assuming is a certification class where they're doing an exercise known as a fin pivot. In a fin pivot, basically you just show you can go up and down having neutral buoyancy. And what happens is this is likely the instructor over here, and that instructor, as you see, is watching them. Now, when you stop and think about it, the first time I ever heard this expression, "you can't stop stupid," was when I was going through scuba instructor training. The course director basically said, "you can't stop stupid." And I was sitting there thinking, wait a second, this whole class I'm taking is essentially how to stop stupid. When you look at scuba diving, because scuba diving, there's countless ways you can kill yourself, literally countless ways. I've done it myself on many occasions. Well, not as many, as an instructor, I should say, I've never done it. But the reality is, I've done some stupid things. But when you stop and look at the dive industry relies upon people living. And what they've done is scuba skills are taught by, PADI, Professional Association of Diving Instructors, SSI, a few others. And all these organizations have basically gone through a whole bunch of dive injuries and figured out, why do these dive injuries happen? We need them not to happen because we need a safe dive industry or nobody will go diving. So you basically look at the scuba skills, and they're taught before a student comes into my class. They have to go through and they have to essentially take a medical to make sure that they're not going to die of a heart attack or something. Then we put them in a pool, and they're supposed to swim a little bit and float a little bit. We don't really care if you can swim. That's what all the dive equipment's for. Then the reality is we just care you're not going to freak out in water, because freaking out in water is what really kills people at the end of the day. So we need to make sure of that. Then before they actually go in the water, they have to take like dozens of hours of training on how not to kill themselves. Then when we put them in the water, we check all their equipment. We teach them to check their equipment. And then we go ahead and put them in a shallow end of the pool and slowly take them deeper. Then when we know they can do everything we need them to do in the real world, then we take them to the real world in a very, for example, you can see the bubbles are going straight up, which says there really isn't a current, reasonably good visibility and all that sort of stuff. But the thing, like this person could only go ahead and look at one person at a time. But click the button, please. What you don't see here is, and you can barely see this, I'm thinking here, is there was another person that they brought along as an assistant instructor or dive master to watch the rest of the people to make sure these people don't kill themselves in the process. I was once that instructor, and what happened was one of the people over here decided, hey, what's actually under the platform? And luckily, I caught them in the corner of my eye, but luckily the assistant instructor was pulling them out before I did. That people will do stupid things. But anyway, even if they do stupid things, we know where the hospitals are, the barometric chambers are, we know have insurance on everybody, and so on. But anyway, that's diving. And the reason I put that there should be a lot of parallels to how safe diving is compared to cybersecurity. So anyway, where does blame actually fall? In safety science, they've gone ahead and done a lot of things and figured out, hey, why do people injure themselves on the job? 90% of that turns out to be the environment that the people are in. For example, I work, when I do awareness programs for large companies, sometimes there's a factory or manufacturing areas and things like that. I walk around with the safety science people, and one time they were showing me, you see this yellow line on the floor, and we were walking around the warehouse, and they said, we used to have approximately 100 injuries a year where forklifts were driving into people walking through the factory. And we did all these studies, and finally we figured out we're going to draw a line on the floor. And people stay to one side, forklifts stay to the other side. And that took care of almost every injury resulting from forklifts and other things. And what happened was, they still had an injury every so often. And when they did that, they figured out, well, that was a person on their iPhone walking down and accidentally bearing into the wrong side, or a driver not paying attention on their iPhone crashing into people. So these things happen, but generally, 90% is the environment around the user. 10% is the user themselves. Because think about it, can a user actually click on ransomware if it's not in their inbox? Nobody thinks of that one. So what is the other 10%? And you got to look at the 10%. The 10% includes carelessness. It might include blatant ignorance. It could be a lack of training. Something else a lot of people don't consider is malice. And this is something like when people say we need more awareness for ransomware, if you think more awareness is the complete solution, you're going to get your organization killed. Because malice, according to the Verizon data breach report, was responsible for 28% of all attacks in a recent date. Can't remember which year. It wasn't the latest. I didn't read the latest. They're all essentially the same thing with slightly different numbers. You all know that. But anyway, this is where awareness and training might fit in that last 10%. But still, it's only 10% of the overall problem that awareness can satisfy. This means as cybersecurity people, we got to figure out how to address that 90%. So now I talked about safety science before. Let's talk counterterrorism. And counterterrorism, there's a concept they call boom. Boom is actually the attack itself. And so then you have people, professionals who in counterterrorism that specialize in left of boom and right of boom. If you think about it on a timeline, from left of boom starts when terrorists start planning the attacks. Right of boom is after the attack. How do you respond and try to repair the organization? So what is boom? Essentially, like I said, counterterrorism strategy. But left of boom includes prevention and protection. Right of boom is response, recovery, resiliency. So if we're talking about prevention and protection, prevention might be, for example, the people in terrorism who specialize in identifying potential terrorists, trying to hunt them down, trying to stop them, whatever. Protection are the people, they don't really know exactly who the terrorists are. They're not going to necessarily stop them, but they're responsible, for example, for hardening buildings. They'll say they'll be like, okay, I need to have an evacuation plan. I need to have like cement pillars in front of buildings and so on. But those people specialize in protection, while other people specialize in stopping the attacks from happening in the first place. Then we have at the point of boom. Boom, at the point of boom is like, how do you harden a facility? So if we're going back, well, it's almost ancient history these days, 20 years, to the September 11th attacks. Everybody remembers the World Trade Center attack because it's very visible. Terrorists really care primarily about visibility. Having images of like towers fall is one thing. A lot of people don't remember that the Pentagon was attacked on the same day. Now, it sounds bad, but the way I say it, only about 100 people were killed inside the Pentagon when they flew a plane in the building. But a good portion of that was because they actually hardened the Pentagon before the attack just because they were concerned about a bomb going off inside. So they hardened the walls, they put more fire protection. So when the plane actually went in, it actually caused very limited damage to what it could have been because the whole building was hardened. So anyway, that's at the point of boom. You can do things like that, strengthen cockpit doors and so on, or another example. Then in response, recovery, and resiliency, you have to, for example, train first responders not to rush right into an environment because it sounds counterintuitive, but if there's poisonous gas in the environment, if there's radiation or biological weapons, There's the potential for secondary explosion, so you have to know how to respond quickly. You have to make sure there's hospitals in the area, enough hospitals to take care of the concerns and so on. And then you have to figure out how to rebuild. When we look at these principles for cybersecurity, I came up with a concept of what I call user-initiated loss. Because at the end of the day, a user doesn't cause the damage. Even if a user clicks on ransomware, the user doesn't go into a hard drive and encrypt every bit. The computer encrypts every bit of the computer itself. The computer is essentially committing suicide. The user doesn't do it. The user just takes an action that results in there. Just because the user does something, it doesn't mean it has to do something. And also, I say user-initiated loss instead of user error, because, again, likewise, it might be malice. It could be not a lack of awareness. I mean, it could be the user intends to do something. It could be that, the user just wants to do something that's wrong. But either way, I like to take out the cause and call it user-initiated loss, but acknowledge that the user, again, is just initiating the loss. And again, it just creates the possibility of a loss that doesn't have to be realized. Could be ignorance. If you want to stop the potential for the loss, in other words, you want to do something, let the boom, and then you want to stop the actual initiation of the loss, which comes out to write a boom. But then you want to mitigate the loss afterwards, again, assuming that the loss did occur in some way. So when we start talking about user-initiated loss from the left-to-boom perspective, you want to really stop the user from being in the position to click on things. If we're talking ransomware, you don't want to put ransomware in the user's box. You want to block the user, for example, from going to websites that might be dangerous and so on. So perhaps you want to take away capability or decision-making. A lot of people are like, no, we want to empower the users. No, you don't. You want the users to do just the things they need to do with the capabilities they need to do it. Protection, detection, reaction. You would need to create a culture of consequences. And a lot of people say, well, gee, no, we don't want to blame the user. It's like, users are limited. You got to acknowledge that. Users are busy. Users have a variety of different issues to, address. But you want to essentially create a culture where they do the right things. I tell the story. When I worked at NSA, I worked at National Security Agency for people who don't know. And there was one time I was working shift work, and this guy working with me, he's irrelevant until I start telling this story. But I was working on this plotter that drew maps out, and I had to take my badge off because the plotter would, wrap the badge up if you didn't have it. Safety, of course. And then what happened was I had to run to the toilet. And I basically ran out to the toilet, forgot my badge, which I realized when I ran into a security guard in the hall doing his rounds. And the guard's like, where's your badge? I go, right, probably on my desk. He's like, we're going to your desk. And I'm like, you're not allowed anywhere near my desk. So anyway, he's like, I'll wait by the door. So I go, he waits by the door, go to my desk. And all of a sudden, I'm like looking around, can't find the badge. And my coworker's like, are you looking for something, Ira? I'm like, where's my effing badge? Sorry, I don't want to curse on YouTube. I don't know why. But anyway, I go, where's my effing badge? And all of a sudden, the guard, and the guard's like, is there a problem? Yelling from the door. And I'm like, and finally the guy goes, do you think I ever forgot that badge again? That was a culture where, again, everything was put in place. The guards were doing rounds and all that sort of stuff. Next is governance. And this is a part that a lot of people ignore. Governance, everybody thinks, okay, write policies, procedures. Basically, most organizations treat it like they write these documents, they get put on the shelf until the auditor shows up. They take them off the shelf. The auditor says, okay, great, you have the policy, you're done. But governance should really define how an organization does things from start to finish. What is the policy? What are people supposed to do at every step along the way? You don't normally see that done in a lot of organizations. In other words, how is a person, like you always tell people, make sure that it's not from a hacker. Make sure that it's like they never tell people how to do that. They basically just say, check an email. They don't say how, for example. But anyway, the user actions are there by default. You have to make sure you document these actions. And that's what's left out in a lot of cases. So at the point of boom, the user at this case, we're talking about the user's presented with the opportunity to initiate a loss. We could be talking about phishing and ransomware. We could be talking about USB drops. We could be talking about a user filling in an email address, and it could be the wrong address or so on. But either way, they have the opportunity. What do? Do they do it, detect it? Do they prevent it? Do they sound the alarm? And remember, this can be from any cause, whether it's accident, careless, willful, malicious, whatever. Because think about it. A lot of people could say, somebody shows up and they might want to send the message to the wrong Michael, and they might be emailing out, for example, critical design documents. And then you go to the person, I meant the other Michael, not the criminal I sent it to. Those things happen. But it really doesn't matter why they wanted to send it to the wrong Michael, or whether it was an accident or on purpose. So anyway, this is the point, that the user has the opportunity. What do they do? What's the guidance on how to do this, and so on? So, and here's policies and governance. Again, I love awareness, but I simultaneously hate how it's practiced. I'll give you that. And what I mean by that is do people know Elmer Fudd here in Greece? Okay, people know Elmer Fudd. If you don't know, apparently there's a new Space Jam movie because Shaquille O'Neal is out and Kobe Bryant is in. But anyway, there's a new Space Jam movie with Elmer Fudd. Elmer Fudd was always on the lookout for Bugs Bunny, trying to hunt Bugs Bunny. And if Bugs Bunny would put on a dress, Elmer Fudd would never recognize Bugs Bunny. It was that bad. And that made it funny for some reason. But the reality is that's our users. We're training them how to look out for Elmer Fudd. Somebody gets an email and they remember the video. Oh, is this a hacker I saw in the video trying to trick me? Or is this really the CEO of the company who needs something desperately? And it's like, you don't want this case. You don't want, because here's the concept. When you're looking at an email, a lot of them look amateurish, but you're basically taking your lowest level user and putting them at odds with potentially a trained sociopath, organized crime. We saw the shadow brokers and what's the latest one? A dark side with the Colonial Pipeline incident and all those things. These people are skilled criminals. They're going to find a way to trick people. But you got to go ahead and tell the users how to do things the right way, not what to be afraid of. And then, got to figure out, are all their actions necessary? Tell them what actions are necessary, what are not. But don't rely upon the user as your first line of defense. Your user's not your first line of defense. Your user's not your last line of defense. And if they are, you have failed as a security professional. So, boom, a loss has been initiated. But the good part is just because somebody initiates a loss doesn't mean the loss has to be realized. Does the environment expect it? For example, if the users don't have admin privileges, they might not be able to download malware. If there's anti-malware on the system, ransomware should not be able to load in general. Are there additional protections? For example, is there data leak prevention? Are there behavioral-based anti-malware to try to stop ransomware once it starts running? That stops systems from encrypting itself. And then also, boom, do you go back and go ahead and analyze incidents after the fact to figure out why these things happen? Was it a failure of policies? Was it a failure of technology? Was it a failure of awareness or whatever else? Maybe you can have your users do more additional things and so on. Here's essentially a mapping. I went ahead and, hopefully I apologize to the people in the room. It's a bad angle for this. But I went ahead and mapped out what has to happen for a phishing message to be successful, and from start to finish. And when you look at this, what happens is, and hopefully this will, what just happened? Okay, anyway, so what happens is a malicious actor, they have to start with a botnet. And somehow the entire security community on the internet has to allow that botnet to exist. Then they send an email message out. The message goes to a perimeter device, and if the perimeter device, for example, is running DMARC, you might be able to prevent that message from getting any further because the site it comes from was unauthenticated as it was from the sender. Then, from the perimeter device, it goes to the mail server, the actual mail server itself. If the mail server is running good anti-malware, the mail server is running good anti-spams and other things, again, the mail server should theoretically stop the message from getting any further. But if the mail server fails, then it gets to the email client. Then the email client, frankly, should stop the message itself. But if the email client doesn't stop the message, then you have it either goes to an inbox or a spam box on things like Outlook or other email clients. And then it becomes a user interface. Then the user at this point basically has to decide whether or not they actually want to go ahead and open a message. But it's a different user experience if it's in its inbox, because it might be assumed to be safe, while something in a spam box should be assumed to be not safe, and so on. But anyway, then the user now makes the decision. And the user in that environment should have nudges. Maybe that includes a little signs. Maybe that includes like banners. A lot of email servers now put banners saying this comes from outside the company. There's a lot of companies now working on nudges. Then you also have awareness, where hopefully policies feed procedures, where the procedures then feed the awareness efforts, and so on. And then the user then has that. Then once the user makes their decision, they take an action. Now, hopefully they don't take the action, but if they take the action, there's a lot of user interfaces now that say, hey, that link goes to an unsafe site. That message might, do you really want to open this message up? It looks dangerous and so on. And then the user should be able to go ahead and say no. But let's say the user says, screw it, I want to go ahead and enter that or look at that message anyway and take the action. In that case, you should have anti-malware filters. You should have, what are the three potential actions usually for phishing messages? They might want to load malware like ransomware. They might want you to send out sensitive materials, or they might want to compromise credentials like, say, log on to this website and enter your email credentials. So then what happens? If there's malware, first thing that should happen are permissions. That user doesn't have permission to download files and install software, for example. And then if that fails, then there should be anti-malware on the system that says, we're not going to let you load this file because this file is malware. On the other hand, let's say there's sensitive materials and it asks, please send out your latest documents or your tax forms or whatever. And that should go into data leak prevention. Maybe the user doesn't have permission to access the files in question. Data leak prevention should also stop it. Compromised credentials, there should be web content filters that say, hey, wait a second, you're not going to a legitimate logon site, as an example. And this all should mitigate this. But when you look at it, the user just takes one action here, and for loss to be realized, basically your whole technology infrastructure has to fail to begin with, and then you have to have a really bad technology infrastructure to allow all that to be realized. So when you look at user security engineering, I kind of came up with a model of visualizing it. One of my friends said to call this a bow tie and say, because what has to happen is governance should drive your entire infrastructure. Governance should say, here is specifically what my security policies are, here's the technology I need, and so on. And so what happens is governance feeds the technology infrastructure like the perimeter devices. Then you have the endpoint technology. Endpoint technologies might include anti-malware, includes permissions, it includes whatever else there is to stop users from doing stuff. Then you have what this example, user experience. User experience is how is information presented to the user? How can you go ahead and tell the user this is potentially harmful, lead the users to the right decisions with a series of nudges and awareness? Then the user takes the action. But at the same time, once the user takes the action, it should have to go through all these layers on the way out. So, for example, the system should say, hey, wait a second, that's not a good idea. Do you really want to still do it? Then the user says, yeah, I still want to do it. Then the endpoint technology should say, no, you're not allowed. And if the endpoint technology allows them, the technology infrastructure like data leak prevention, like all anti-malware on hard storage drives all anti-malware on all the drives around the organization are protected themselves and so on. And again, governance then goes back and figures out why did the attack get as far as it did. So anyway, most important takeaway, your user is essentially just your canary in the coal mine. They're not really aware of security. If a user fails, if a user fails, it's a problem with your whole system. They're not your first line of defense or your last line of defense. They essentially are a part of the system, and if they do something wrong, it's a failure of the system as a whole. So anyway, everybody should buy my awesome book. People here, it looks like some people will get my book, and that's me. Any questions?